Hello. In this part of the presentation, we're going to look at actually doing a CBT assessment. And we're going to illustrate that with a role-played interview in which I'm the therapist and my colleague Sarah Greer is playing a client called Lucy. To use this chapter, you should already know the material covered in presentation 1, the basic CBT theory, and in the earlier parts of this presentation on the role of formulation in CBT. An important note is to say in this presentation we're focusing just on assessment for the purpose of a CBT formulation, not the other kinds of assessment that may be important in some settings, for example, risk assessment. So, to begin with, let's just see a brief introduction to Lucy, the client who we're going to be working with in this presentation. Okay, Lucy, thanks for coming along today. Could I perhaps just start by explaining a little bit about what I'd like to do today? There isn't going to be any treatment or anything at this stage. Basically, all I want to do at the moment is find out a little bit about you and about the problems that you've been having, so that hopefully we can begin to understand something about those problems and we can start thinking about what we might do about them.
Yeah.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. And if it's okay with you, I'll make some notes as we go along because I can't keep everything in my head. All right? Yeah. So, Lucy, I've heard a very little bit from your doctor, but it would be useful, I think, to start off by hearing in your words what's brought you here today. What's the problem that you're worried about?
Well, I mean, I just feel awful, and I had a massive panic attack actually on the way to my doctor.
Uh-huh. What, when you went to talk about this?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and it was just awful, and it just, I just can't keep going through life like this. It's just, yeah, I've just been feeling really anxious, quite upset about most things most of the time, and I just feel like I'm no good at anything.
Okay. So you're feeling anxious and upset quite a lot of the time.
Yeah.
You said that you had a panic attack when you went to the doctor. Is that something that's happened more than just that occasion? Are you getting panic attacks regularly at the moment?
Well, I mean, the worst place is probably Tesco. And when I go into the supermarket, I have to now only go in the evenings because I just don't want people to see me. I just don't want to sort of look stupid.
Let's begin by looking at the process of assessment in CBT. And it's important to be aware here that CBT assessment is not a straightforward trawling for simple facts or ticking off items on a checklist. This kind of assessment is a very active process and involves constantly trying to generate and test hypotheses about what might be going on here. And importantly, that process also continues throughout therapy. So even when the initial assessment session is done, that's not the end of it. So let's look at this process of doing a CBT assessment. First of all, we gather some information. Perhaps initially this may come from the referral letter or from the first few things that the client says to us during an interview. From whatever source, we try then to use what we know of CBT theory to try and make sense of this information, to try and generate or later modify hypotheses about what might be going on here, how we could understand the processes involved in this person's problem. And we then use those initial ideas to guide our further questioning, to think about what kind of information will help us to confirm or perhaps refute those hypotheses. So we have a circular process that we go round repeatedly of gathering information, trying to make sense of it, using the initially tentative hypotheses to guide further information gathering. And we go round and round this loop several times, probably many times during an assessment, until we get to a point where we've got some initial ideas about the formulation, and we think there's enough of an idea to start discussing that with the client. So we work together with the client to try and make sense of that information and develop an initial working formulation. That formulation then helps to guide our treatment targets, amongst other things, and that process of gathering information may well continue through treatment. It may be that during treatment we'll discover further information that means we may need to modify the initial formulation. So again, we may go round this loop process during the course of treatment as well. Most commonly, that kind of modification is relatively minor tweaking of the formulation, but occasionally it may be that something emerges during the course of therapy that actually means we really need to make quite substantive changes to the formulation. So let's just have a look at a short clip from the interview with Lucy here to illustrate this process of testing out hypotheses. Do you have ideas in your mind about what kind of answers they would be coming up with to those questions? You know, what would they think had made you fall over? Or
I probably think I'm mad.
They think you were mad?
Yeah.
Okay. And is that the very worst thing that might happen, that you fall over? Do you ever think about anything beyond that?
Well, I mean, the fact that they're thinking quite nasty things about me and thinking, you know, that I'm stupid and just, I mean, that feels pretty terrible. Just be thinking that I'm sort of not worth anything. I'm just, you know, not good enough.
You're not thinking that, for example, I don't know, that you might collapse and die or something like that. It's not that kind of thought that's going through your mind.
No, I don't think I've ever thought that.
Okay.
Pretty sure I'd wake up and there'd be lots of people all staring at me.
All right.
Yeah, it's always come back to waking up.
Okay. And can I just check, because I mean, it sounds pretty clear as if it's other people are a major part of this for you.
Yeah.
Is that right? So, I mean, suppose, for example, that you could go to Tesco's. I mean, some of them are open 24 hours now, aren't they? Suppose you could go to Tesco's at 5 o'clock in the morning and you'd be pretty sure that you wouldn't run into anybody else at all.
Yeah.
Would that be easier for you?
Well, I already do go in the evening.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I try to go kind of quite late because I just think, well, you know, avoid people if I could, then it's easier.
Okay. So you would deliberately try and be there at times that are less likely to be busy. Okay.
I mean, so 9 o'clock, there's not many people.
Yeah.
It's quite empty. So.
Yeah. Okay. So Tesco's is bad.
Yeah.
Are there any other things that you're aware of that make a difference to how difficult this is, or situations that you know are going to be difficult?
Well, I mean, I don't really go out with friends as much as I used to, so you know, it's not. But I think if I went out to a pub or if we went out for a meal or something, I'd probably feel the same. But I'm quite worried about that at the moment, so I haven't really been going out.
You haven't been going out because of thinking that it would cause this problem, or for some other reason?
Well, yeah, I think I've just been feeling quite anxious, and so I just thought, well, you know, I want my friends to see, and you know, they don't really know they wouldn't necessarily know what to say, and I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't want to ruin the friendship by kind of like showing this part.
And if you were going to feel anxious, it sounds to me, can I just check out that this is right, that it would be worse for you to be surrounded by people who knew you than it would be to be surrounded by strangers. Is that right?
I don't know. No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think it would be better with friends.
Okay.
Because I think they're friends because they like me. But yeah, I just don't want to, you know, I think they like me and they don't, I think, you know,
so friends would be more likely to be kind of forgiving.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I don't really want to know like the whole picture.
Okay. So can I just try and put this together with what you were saying before? Because you mentioned that one of the things that was bad about Tesco's was that there might be people in there who would know you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you're also saying that actually it would be better to have friends than strangers. So is it that the people you might bump into Tesco as kind of somehow halfway between being friends and strangers?
Yeah.
So people who know you but don't really know you?
Yeah.
Is
Like
that right?
acquaintances, people that know of you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a kind of continuum from complete strangers who are not so bad, and at the other end, friends who are not so bad, but it's the people in the middle who are the worst.
Yeah, because I'm pretty sure that my friends, I've told a couple of them that I haven't been feeling all that well.
Right.
But I haven't told them the whole story. But I mean, I'd hope that they would be understanding. I mean, you never know, but I'd hope they would.
So let's think about the areas that we need to cover in an assessment interview in order to be able to develop the formulation. First of all, we want to look at the current pattern of the problems. Secondly, we want to look at the consequences of the problem for the client and how they and other people have tried to cope with it. And third, we want to look at the past history and the development of the problem. I'm going to go through them in this order in this presentation and indeed in the interview that you'll see. But it's perhaps important to note that they're not necessarily actually done in this order in a real interview, nor would they often be as clearly separated as this kind of scheme suggests. In a real interview, we may go backwards and forwards between talking about current problems at one point or talking about past history in the next minute and then going back to current problems again. But in order to illustrate it, it's clearer if we keep them separate. So assessing current problems, the first thing that we want to do is get a problem list. And it's important to be aware for this that that doesn't mean a list of diagnoses or diagnostic labels. A problem list is not depression, social anxiety, and so on. What we mean by a problem list in this context is a list of the specific symptoms that the person has in those 4 systems that we've talked about before. So in terms of thoughts, affect, behavior, and physiological changes. In terms of assessing thoughts, there are lots of different ways that we can try and get at people's thoughts, asking them to relate typical incidents when the problem shows itself is perhaps the most obvious. And the classic question that CBT therapists use to ask people about their thoughts is, what goes through your mind when, for example, when you have a panic attack or when you try and get into a conversation with somebody or whatever it may be. A second useful technique can be to look out for what people sometimes call hot thoughts during a session. What we mean by hot thoughts is thoughts that happen whilst the person is feeling emotionally aroused in some way and which are therefore actually active at that moment. So it can be very useful to look out for emotional changes in your client during the course of a session, and if something happens, to ask them about it. For example, you looked a bit upset just now. What was going through your mind just then? Another way of getting at these kind of thoughts is to ask your client to do thought records as a homework task. So perhaps between the first assessment session and the second session, you could ask them to record some of their thoughts, obviously with a lot of explanation about how to go about that and so on. And lastly, again, just to remind you, don't forget to look for images as well as verbal thoughts. In asking people about affect, it's not, for most people, a problem, although you do come across occasional clients who find it very difficult to recognize or label different moods. But for most people, the most common problem that they may need help with is in distinguishing thoughts and emotions. This is not helped by the fact that in English we often talk about I feel that such and such, when what we actually mean is I think that such and such. There's a possible rule of thumb that you can use here that is not absolutely accurate but serves as a useful guide for most clients, which is that if what they're talking about takes a lot more than one word, then it's probably a thought and not an emotion. Because most emotions can be described, at least crudely, with one word: sad, angry, happy, etc. All of these, of course, there are nuances, but at least crudely we can describe them with one word. Whereas if it's something like, I might die of a heart attack, then clearly it takes more than one word to convey that, and it's therefore a thought, not an emotion. Behavior, again, clients often find relatively easy. What we mean by this is their observable actions and all the things that they say. If it's not clear, then possible questions to get at this are looking at the two sides of it. First of all, what do you now do that you didn't used to do because of the problems? And also important because of the prevalence of avoidance, for example, in anxiety disorders, what have you now stopped doing because of the problems? And both those questions may help to guide you towards behavioral aspects of your client's problem. Physiological changes, again, at least in anxiety, people are usually fairly well aware of these. Typically, autonomic nervous system arousal in anxiety or anger, things like changes in heart rate, muscle tension, sweating, shaking, breathing difficulties, and so on. We would usually include the so-called biological symptoms of depression under this heading as well: changes in sleep patterns, loss of appetite for food, loss of sexual interest, and so on. A very useful strategy for getting at all of these four systems and some of the relationships between them is to ask your client to relate to you a specific recent incident when their problem occurred or when their problem was particularly bad. So, for example, the last time you had a panic attack or the last time you felt particularly depressed. And then ask your client to take you through that incident moment by moment, sometimes almost even second by second. So what was the very first thing you noticed? What did you think about that? What did it make you feel? What did you do about that? Did you notice any changes in your body? And then what happened? What did you think about that? And so on. So taking you through it step by step. And it may even be helpful sometimes to ask clients to close their eyes and try and imagine bringing the situation back to life in their mind. It can be a very useful strategy for getting hold of all of the four systems. Let's just have a look at a bit from Lucy's interview that illustrates this strategy. When's the last panic attack that you had? You mentioned that you'd had one when you went to the doctors. Is that the last one you had, or have you had one more recently than that?
Well, no, I think it was probably the last one. It wasn't. Yeah, I mean, I feel pretty anxious, quite a lot of the time. But that was probably the one that's sort of stuck in my memory.
Okay. How long ago was that, roughly?
Well, she put me on to you, and it didn't take that long. It's about 3 weeks ago.
2 or 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. But you think you can remember that quite clearly?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask you to try and remember that for me whilst I ask you a bit about it? Now, I just want to make sure before we do that sometimes when people start thinking about panic attacks, that may be enough sometimes to make them feel quite uncomfortable. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you find that this is getting too difficult for you, please tell me and we can back off for a little while. Okay. So thinking back to that last one that we were just talking about, can you remember at what point, what was the very first thing that you noticed that made you think, something's going on here?
I'm getting quite anxious just thinking about it right
now.
now,
You?
actually.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Is it all right if we carry on talking about it?
Yeah.
Sure?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was in... I mean, I started picking up on it when I was in the car park, actually, because I noticed there was quite a few cars there.
Okay.
And I started thinking, well, it's going to be quite a lot of people sort of waiting around. And you know what waiting rooms are like. They're just, there's just so many people, and everyone's really pretending to read a magazine, but they're really looking at everybody else. And
okay.
I started thinking, well, if I'm going to go in that waiting room, and they're all going to look at me, and they're going to think, what's wrong with her? Why is she like that?
Okay.
She's just so.
So, sorry, let me just kind of slow you down a little bit, because I think there's a lot of detail here that may be important sometimes. So, on this occasion at least, the very first thing was your thinking there's going to be lots of people in there.
Yeah.
And thinking that means that they would all be looking at you or at other people as well? Or?
I guess I hadn't really thought of it quite like that, but yeah, me.
At you specifically?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so you had that thought as you went through the car park. How did that affect you when that thought went through your mind? How did that make you feel?
Well, pretty awful. I mean, I'm sort of feeling quite sort of really tense, and I mean sometimes I feel a bit sick, but I didn't feel that sick at that point. But yeah, I was feeling pretty panicky and just thinking, perhaps I shouldn't come here. Perhaps I should just go home. Perhaps it'd be a lot easier if I just,
okay,
didn't have to come. But thought, no, I need to come. I need to sort of say what's going on. And yeah, so then I just thought, well, I'm just going to go in. But then I got worse. Got in, I could sort of feel it, the anxiety getting worse, and feel myself panicking.
So you have the thoughts, then you start to feel tense and panicky,
Yeah.
and you're thinking about just turning around and going out, but then you decided to carry on.
Yeah.
But things got
Yeah.
more difficult for you.
Yeah, I mean, there were lots of people there, and I could just feel myself getting worse, and I was starting to sweat, and I thought, right, everyone's going to see that I'm really, unwell, and they're just going to think I'm, an absolute freak. They're going to think I'm so stupid. And
Sounds as if it's quite difficult even to remember that. Were you having any of those thoughts when you came here today?
Well, I mean, not really. My doctor was quite understanding about it, and said that, was it just me, and I could probably get some help for it. So.
Okay. So you're beginning to feel quite tense and panicky, and you're feeling sweaty. Did you notice on this occasion any other bodily feelings? Did you have the heart pounding, for example, that you mentioned?
Well, I could feel my pulse sort of going quite a lot, and my shoulders, my shoulders getting quite tense. But mostly it's the sweating. 'Cause I think it's just so obvious.
So the sweating is the very worst thing for you.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I just ask you, just as a bit of a side note, you mentioned earlier that nobody has ever kind of said, "Oh, look at that sweaty woman." Has anybody ever mentioned to you that you get sweaty in these situations? Maybe family or friends or anything like that?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
But I mean, as I say, I kind of try to cover it because I'm just quite aware of it. So maybe they haven't noticed. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. So that's a really helpful picture of what happens. This particular incident that you were talking about, is that a fairly typical incident, or was there anything unusual about it?
Well, I get like a similar sort of experience when I go to Tesco's, because it's just loads of people, and everyone's sort of standing around, and especially in the queues, they're just standing around looking at people. And
right. But what happens is fairly similar to what you just described.
I mean, that one was pretty bad, but
it was particularly bad.
Yeah, but I think on the whole, that's pretty much what happened.
The next bit that we want to look at in terms of assessing the current problems is what we call triggers and modifiers. What we mean by that is that triggers are situations or events or other variables that make the problem more likely to occur. These triggers determine when the problem happens. Modifiers, on the other hand, are factors which, when the problem does occur, make a difference to how severe it is, things that make it worse or better. Let's try and illustrate this with a slightly silly example. Suppose somebody had a phobia of rabbits. Then, by definition, one of the triggers for such a phobia would be rabbits. But on the other hand, typically those triggers tend to generalize somewhat from the original focus. So it might well be that, for example, pictures or movies or perhaps cartoons of rabbits might also act as triggers for this phobia. In some cases, even the word rabbit may be a problem. I did have one client several years ago who had such a severe spider phobia that she actually couldn't use the word spider, but for some reason I never discovered, called them Marthas. So through the first few sessions of treatment, we had to talk about her problem with Marthas. So all of these, and maybe others, would act as triggers for our rabbit phobia. Modifiers would be things that make a difference, given that the phobia has been triggered, make a difference to how severe it is. So, for example, perhaps the size of the rabbit might make a difference. Big rabbits may be more scary than small ones. How far away it is. Perhaps close rabbits are more fearful than distant rabbits. Perhaps how big its teeth are. Whether I'm with somebody who may be able to help me if the rabbit attacks me. All of these things may make a difference to our rabbit phobia, and therefore we'd call them modifiers. Many different kinds of factors can act as triggers or modifiers, and it may be important to keep these in mind because clients sometimes don't come out with all of them spontaneously. So obvious situational factors, specific situations or events or objects or places. Interpersonal factors, maybe the problem is better or worse with particular people or only occurs in the presence of particular people. Cognitive factors, sometimes specific kinds of thoughts can be problematic for people. Behavioral factors, that doing particular activities. Physiological, for example, physical illness of some kind, or for women, the point in the menstrual cycle, or perhaps drug influences. And affective factors. Specific mood states may cause a problem. Or for some people, strong moods of any kind may cause a problem, even positive moods. The point of looking at all of these is that they may give us very useful clues about some of the beliefs or about some of the maintaining processes. So we can ask ourselves, for example, is there a general theme that seems to link the factors that the person is reporting as triggers or modifiers? If so, there may be a belief around that theme. They're also useful later in therapy in identifying targets for therapy and in planning behavioral experiments. So, for example, if I have somebody who's agoraphobic and has difficulty going to the supermarket, then it may be very helpful to know the factors that make it more or less likely that she will panic in the supermarket. As I said, clients don't always find it easy to identify these factors, and quite often the first reaction from a client may be that actually nothing makes any difference to it. I'm anxious all the time, or I'm depressed all the time. This is almost never actually true. It's usually just a fact that the person is becoming overwhelmed by the problem and they don't notice the differences anymore. So it's always worth persisting, at least for a bit, with asking about modifying factors. The last bit of looking at the current problems is the consequences. What impact has it had on the client's life? What have they lost, or maybe sometimes what have they gained as a result of having the problem? How have other people who are important to them responded to the problem? And how have they themselves tried to cope with the problem, both in good ways and in bad ways. So we would include here, for example, alcohol abuse as being an attempt at coping with the problem, just not one that's usually very helpful. Both other people's reactions and the client's attempts at coping may be particularly important in giving you clues about maintaining processes. Because maintaining processes often, not always, but quite often result from failed common sense attempts to manage a problem. Obvious examples are avoidance and reassurance. Both of these are very natural ways of trying to cope with a difficult situation. If you're frightened of something, rabbits for example, then it seems perfectly sensible to try and manage that by avoiding it, or if you come into contact with it, by running very fast to get away from it. These seem like perfectly obvious ways to try and cope. We just happen to know that actually they're not good ways of coping, because what they actually do is serve to maintain or even worsen the problem. And we can see this in folk psychology, for example. You know, people will say things like, if you fall off a horse, what you need to do is get straight back onto it, because there's a recognition that avoiding feared situations is not helpful. Similarly, if somebody you care about is very worried about something, then it seems an obvious common sense way to try and cope with that is to reassure them about it. That may be fine up to a point, but we know that if reassurance becomes repetitive, it's not helpful and may even be making things worse. So as I say, these attempts at trying to cope with a problem, either by the client or by other people, may inadvertently lead to maintaining processes. Important to be clear here that this does not imply any intent on anybody's person. Most people are not wanting to make things worse. They're doing their best to try and cope. They just happen to be choosing the wrong strategy. The other aspect of coping that may be important is almost the opposite of what we were just talking about, which is that sometimes people actually have pretty good coping strategies, which with a bit of work you can build on usefully in therapy to make them more effective. Perhaps by analyzing more carefully what works and what doesn't, perhaps by getting the person to apply their strategies more consistently, perhaps by applying what are good strategies to different areas that the client hasn't tried. Let's have a look at the part of the interview where I'm interviewing Lucy about her current problems.